Thank you very much. It's great to be here, everybody. Unfortunately, I'm not able to share my slides and the production team will have to do that. So if you could move to the first slide. And maybe if we can move to the next slide, that would be great. Fantastic. So this is what I'm going to try and cover in my 20 minutes today. Talk a little bit about, so Rob has just been talking to you about consumption and consumer issues generally. Good On You's work focuses primarily on supporting consumers to make more sustainable choices in the fashion industry. So in relation to our clothing, our footwear, accessories, and so on. Although the model we have developed is definitely applicable to other sectors, and we may move into those sectors in the future. And so I want to talk a little bit about the impact of consumption with a focus on fashion, and then focus a lot on the power of consumer choices, and then what Good On You does as one step to support consumers making more sustainable choices. And then, of course, address briefly the impact of COVID-19 and some thoughts on after COVID-19. So if we could go to the next slide. So there's no doubt that consumer choices are key to the impacts on the planet, that are key to unsustainable consumption that we're faced with now. I think it was recently discussed that taking the UK, a sustainable level of consumption would be a sustainable level of waste, I think, was 8 billion tonnes, but they're looking at more than 2 times that. So the level of consumption at the moment is unsustainable, as we all know, and in many countries by more than double what it needs to be. So consumer choices are key drivers of consumption. Sure, businesses and governments consume things too, consume resources, but ultimately it's the consumers who need the governments to do stuff. It's the consumers who buy from businesses, who buy from other businesses. So a key driver of unsustainable consumption is what we choose as consumers. And so working to help consumers make more sustainable consumption is really key in terms of achieving a sustainable world. And that's obviously why Sustainable Development Goal 12, SDG 12, is about enhancing and promoting sustainable, consistent systems of consumption and production. But I think it's really important to bear in mind, this doesn't mean we should blame consumers. We shouldn't be shouting at consumers saying, why aren't you consuming more sustainably? We should be understanding consumers' motivations and working to make it easier for consumers to make those choices. And so I think we've seen from Rob's presentation, and I will also give you some data on the fact that a majority of consumers are motivated to make more sustainable choices. But we need to look at what's stopping them. And I would say that current systems of consumption and production make it too hard for consumers to act on their motivation to consume more responsibly. So we should think of consumers not as being obliged to consume responsibly. We should think of them as having the right to consume responsibly and letting their existing motivation, perhaps enhancing their motivation with more information about what's going wrong, drive change. So to say that consumers have an obligation to consume sustainably lets governments and industry off the hook. They can blame unsustainable consumption on consumers. They can say consumers demand these goods at these prices and it's all their fault. But if we turn it around and say consumers have a right to make sustainable choices, then we start to explore what's stopping them. And that leads to the call for governments and industry to make it easier for consumers to make sustainable choices. So one of the key ways to do that is to provide consumers with access to more sustainable options more easily. And so that access includes a range of different things, but I want to highlight 3. One is they need information about alternative ways to consume. So Rob Harrison's organisation, Ethical Consumers UK, have released their fantastic climate gap report. And in that, they talk a lot about opportunities for consumers to consume differently in relation to repairing items to buying secondhand, to renting, to having resale models. And there's a lot of that emerging with some both not-for-profit and for-profit entries into the resale and rental markets that are very successful. Depop, for example, in relation to resale, has come from nowhere. But also it includes providing consumers with information about which sustainable brands are doing better and the options that, the sustainable options that will meet their needs. So if we think about people, we are both consumers and citizens. So as consumers, I would say that our job is to make the most sustainable choice we can within the framework of production and consumption systems that we find ourselves. But as citizens, our job is to lobby government and industry to make those systems more conducive to sustainable consumption. And it's what I really like about the way Ethical Consumers UK has framed their recent report on the climate gap, in that they've made suggestions for how consumers can consume more sustainably in the current situation, which is engage with the circular economy, choose for more sustainable brands in the context of climate change. But they've also suggested exactly what government needs to do, which is to make, to create an obligation for brands to give truthful, accurate and comprehensive information about how they impact on the issues consumers care about. In that particular case, a suggestion that governments legislate to mandate that companies release full information about their climate change impacts of their supply chain. So if you could go to the next slide, please. Very briefly, just talk about some of the key impacts of the fashion industry on sustainability. That major impact on waste and use of resources, big impact on greenhouse gas emissions, water stress and water usage, deforestation is particularly important, and rising impact of fashion, chemical pollution, and that's just touching the surface of the list. Next slide, please. Just one or two of those in a bit more detail. Sorry, if we could have the next slide. Waiting on the next slide. Thank you so much. So waste, it's recently been estimated that the fashion and clothing industry is responsible for about 93 million tonnes of waste per annum. That's about 5% of total solid waste in the world. And if we could go to the next slide. As for greenhouse gas emissions, the United Nations Environment Programme has suggested that the fashion and clothing industry is responsible for 8 to 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. What's interesting about this is, unlike some other industries, the fashion industry's total emissions are not going down. So in some other sectors like energy, there is a trending down. In fact, quite a significant explosion of new renewable resources. But in fashion, that's not happening, or not happening yet. So if we could go to the next slide. Just mentioning whilst we're doing that, aside from environmental sustainability, fashion employs 80 million people globally. Most of them are women, most of them are badly paid and work in poor conditions, and some of them are actually in conditions of modern slavery. So if we could have the next slide. So we come back to this idea that consumers are key drivers of unsustainable consumption. The question is, can they be key drivers of sustainable consumption? And if we look at clothing, there's one really interesting to observe about clothing choices in recent times. Clothing accounts for about 7% of average household expenditure. That's about the same amount of household expenditure as 30 or 40 years ago, just 0.1% lower in countries like the UK and the US. But the number of clothing items we can buy for that same percentage of expenditure has gone up 5 times, 400%. And so, for example, in 2018, Americans bought on average 68 garments each per year. So allowing for population growth, that's about a 25%. The clothing costs about 25% what it did now. And so when people complain about sustainable options costing more, their grandparents would not say that. Their grandparents would say that's what clothes cost. And indeed, that's what they did cost to make back then, because they had different production systems. But the really interesting thing is, what do consumers actually think? what we need, obviously, is for consumers to change their choices in sufficient numbers that it becomes an economic incentive for brands to become more sustainable. That's the theory of change here. The more consumers change to buying from sustainable brands, the more brands will need to produce products that are genuinely sustainable. Or, of course, they could try and greenwash consumers, which Rob says, which as Rob said, is something that they're doing to some extent. But there's also movement towards sustainability, even in some of the big brands. So, as Rob said, surveys show a majority of consumers being interested in making more sustainable choices, and a growing number of consumers being interested in making more sustainable choices. But at the moment, there's still a majority of consumption which is not sustainable. So there's a gap between what consumers say they want to do and what actually happens. So if we could go to the next slide. I also have some research, which is quite hard to see on that slide. Apologies there, but I'll explain the slide in a moment. But the first thing, what explains this gap between 75% of consumers or 60 to 70% of consumers saying that they want to make more sustainable choices and perhaps a significant minority of consumers actually making sustainable choices on a regular basis? I think there are two reasons. The first is that it's quite easy to say to a survey that you are interested in making more sustainable choices or that you would pay more for sustainable goods. But when it comes to actually shopping, you've got a range of competing priorities and you may not actually make the more sustainable choice. But I think the more interesting reason is to think about what's stopping consumers who do believe that they should shop sustainably from actually making their choices. So just to explain this hard to see graph, it's similar to the graph that Rob showed you about the eco-deniers and the eco-active and the eco in the middle. But it's framed slightly differently. This is research by Mobium, mostly in Australia, and they've done it every 2 years for the last 12 years with thousands of surveyed consumers and hundreds of face-to-face interviews. And what they're trying to do is to say, we don't want to just get the easy answer that consumers can give when you ask them a question, would you buy more sustainably? We want to see and understand their behaviour or their values. And their conclusion is that about 10% of consumers really don't care about making sustainable choices at all. About 90% of consumers will say that they're interested in making sustainable choices. Of those, about 14% are actively making sustainable choices. And then in the middle, we have 80% of the population. They say they want to do the right thing, but half of them don't make sustainable choices and don't really care. And the other half, and this is the interesting part, so about 40% of the population, they feel conflicted, they feel bad. They really wanted to make a more sustainable choice and it hurts them when they don't, but they didn't. And so the really interesting thing that we're exploring is how can we make that more easy for people? So I probably need to speed up a little bit to get through this material. So we could go to the next slide. So I said that we've got a conclusion here that over 50% of consumers want to shop more sustainably, whether that's the 50% from the research I'm referring to who feel conflicted or the 60, 70% that Rob points to from the Cantor research. They want to shop more sustainably, but it's too hard to know which products and brands to buy. And that's where Good on You comes in. Next slide, please. To make sustainable choices, you really need to have information about what are the actual problems you need to avoid. Many people know that climate change is a problem, but there are many other sustainability issues which people are not very aware of. So could you go to the next slide? So at Good on You, our job is to help consumers make more sustainable choices. And our vision is a world where anyone can know the true impact of a product as easily as its price. So the problem is that when you go shopping, you know the price of what you're buying. You've got a pretty good idea about the features, the functionality, the style of the product, and you've got lots of access to people online who can tell you whether it's a good quality product or not. But you have almost no information about how that product was made, no information about how that product impacts on the issues you care about related to the environment, to workers or to animals and so on. Consumers are often shocked when they first hear that some of the things they buy might be shedding microfibers and getting those plastic microfibers into waterways, into fish, into our bodies. And the same is true of many other issues like deforestation. I think people would think of trees, paper, cutting down trees to make paper, but in fact, we cut down more trees to make clothes now than we do to make paper. So, next slide, please. So really quickly, what Good On You does is that we try to assess thousands and thousands of fashion brands so consumers have a great range of choice, but know which brands are more sustainable and which are not. We have a directory of brands online at goodonyou.eco, and we have a Good On You app which lists 3,500 brands and how they impact on the environment, workers and animals. And it's all powered by a very comprehensive brand rating system. Can we go to the next slide? The brand rating system identifies the most material issues in the fashion supply chain for the environment, for labour, for animals, and it rates brands for the impact of each of those. It aggregates all the other standards, the fair trade and organic labels, the SA 8000 auditing standards, and also any other information that brands are obliged to publish or choose to publish about how they impact on these issues. It was up over 500 different data points that we're using for larger brands. We go to the next slide. As I said, our theory of change is that if we can get more and more consumers to choose better, that influences brands. Interesting point Rob made about electric vehicles. We do want 100% of people driving electric vehicles and where that electricity comes from renewable sources. But we probably don't need 100% of consumers to choose to drive electric vehicles to get there, because at a certain point, electric vehicles become the dominant choice and everybody just buys them. And so it's about getting enough consumers to choose electric vehicles that their price goes down, that they become the standard choice, and then everybody jumps on board. So let's just quickly wrap up on the COVID and post-COVID impacts on the next slide. So one of the sort of first impacts of COVID was, with everybody in lockdown, a massive acceleration of the existing trend to shop online, both for goods generally, I mean, particularly for clothing, but also beginning, not to this level, but beginning to do so for food and so forth. And that has both risks for sustainable consumption and opportunities. If it's easier to shop online, then maybe people buy more stuff, there's this terrible tendency for people to buy 2 or 3 sizes of a particular item and just send back the ones they don't want. And returns are a really big drag on both businesses and sustainability, because they're often not able to be easily resold, even though they haven't been worn. Next slide, please. Rob's already mentioned the issue of cancelled orders and unpaid workers, which was a very big issue. By lockdown shopping, I mean that people changed what they bought. They changed the kinds of clothes that they wanted to wear, less formal clothes in particular, didn't need going out clothes. And whilst, of course, as we come out of lockdown, we go in and out and in and out and in and out, but when we're out of lockdown, people will probably go back to some of those older ways of buying. But I wouldn't be surprised if there are some changes to what counts as acceptable in terms of clothing, and that influences what we buy. One of the things that we really noticed at Good On You was people caring about their local area. They really wanted to buy locally, and they wanted to know which brands were actually made in their country. And that really shot up once the lockdown began, and all through the time of COVID, it's persisted. And it's an interesting, we get a lot of feedback about that from our users. Rob's already talked about the increased interest in sustainability, and a very interesting question about what's driving that. And finally, if I just talk about a couple of post-COVID things, which are mostly speculation. Can we see the next slide? No idea what post-down shopping is going to look like. I think we can say that the e-commerce trend is just going to continue. We all know that there's massive supply chain challenges as we sort of re-gearing the global system of production and distribution has proved a very big challenge. Whether that drives people to onshore their production more or not is yet to be seen. And there's also an ongoing trend to quality. So it's very interesting, this is Google Trends data, how often people search for information about quality products versus how often people search for information about cheap products. So I think that's, obviously there are competing tensions. We've got, a fast fashion pandemic, if you like. There is an ongoing trend of cheaper and cheaper and nastier fashion brands emerging with even less sustainability measures in place and even less respect for avoiding waste. But at the same time, you have this trend towards people being interested in quality. So how that plays out is very interesting, and how we can try and steer it towards quality and long-lasting products and away from single-use products, the better. And finally, the next slide. So that's all from me. A few notes on interesting good on you on that slide, which I won't read, but otherwise, I think if there's another slide, it will have our email address where you can contact us. Thank you so much.